Jerusalem, 33 AD. According to the Gospels, Jesus gathers his 12 disciples for one last meal. At the center of the supper is an ordinary cup, one many believe will come to hold extraordinary power.
The Holy Grail might be the most famous vessel in history, used by the most famous person to ever live at the most famous meal ever served. Today, we call it the Last Supper. It's thought to have taken place during the Jewish holiday of Passover.
The meal starts with a blessing.
According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus distributes the bread and tells his followers, "Take, eat, this is my body." As the bread is passed around, he then holds up a cup of wine and says, "Drink all of it, for this is my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." The cup appears in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and also in 1 Corinthians.
This is one of the most well-known events in all of Christianity. The night that a cup was held and blessed by Jesus. This simple act has created a legend surrounding this cup that's lasted for over 2,000 years.
Not long after the Last Supper, Judas turns Jesus over to the Roman authorities.
Jesus is then arrested, tried, and executed on the cross.
Was Jesus Christ a real person? Most historians believe he probably was. And this is the moment that Christianity is sort of created. It's really the fundamental belief you're supposed to have as a Christian is that he died and was resurrected.
A lot of historians believe that his crucifixion and even the Last Supper actually happened, as described in the Gospels.
It's a fairly logical assumption that Jesus used the cup at the meal, and of course, anything from the Last Supper, anything Jesus actually touched would be incredibly valuable.
But the cup is also revered for another reason.
According to legend, the Holy Grail is an object that has magical powers. It is an object that is held to be sacred. It is an object that's connected with healing and potentially even with immortality itself.
It's a holy relic, it's been touched by Jesus, and it can provide immortality. This would be the most valuable object in the history of the world.
Then, almost as soon as it's mentioned, the Holy Grail seems to disappear.
You'd think such a sacred item would be meticulously kept track of, but for hundreds of years after the crucifixion, the Grail just vanishes from the historical record.
So where did it go?
Well, the first option is obvious. Maybe it wasn't kept at all. It might have been just treated like any ordinary cup. It gets washed and put away and lost amongst all the other cups.
But one medieval text suggests the cup survives.
In the late 1100s, French author Robert de Boron writes Joseph of Arimathea. In it, he describes what became of the Holy Grail.
Joseph is also a character in the biblical accounts of Jesus' life. He's in all four Gospels, described as the man who takes Jesus' dead body off the cross and has him buried.
Before he does this, according to Robert de Boron, he collects some of Jesus' blood in a cup. In fact, in the cup, the same one that Jesus used at the Last Supper.
Around that time, much of Europe and much of Christianity in general believes that Joseph did manage to preserve the Holy Grail. For over 500 years after Jesus' death, we have no reliable sightings or evidence or writings to go on.
Until 570 AD, when a written account from an anonymous Italian Christian pilgrim surfaces.
We don't know his name, but he's called the Piacenza Pilgrim, the name of his hometown in Italy. And he goes on what you might call an organized tour of holy sites.
There was a big business in the 6th century catering to pious Christians. He goes to Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and his final destination is Jerusalem. When the Piacenza pilgrim arrives, he describes seeing a cup of onyx, which our Lord blessed at the Last Supper, on display.
Is it possible this is the cup?
An onyx cup would have been somewhat fancy, but it's certainly not out of the question. And it's in the right place, as the Grail's last known location was Jerusalem.
It seems to have the right kind of powers, too. The legends describe the Grail's healing abilities, and this cup is associated with the very same kinds of miracles. It's said to have raised several people from the dead.
Another visiting pilgrim named Arculf also sees a cup in the same church in Jerusalem. In his account, visitors are allowed to touch the cup to try and receive some of its power for themselves.
But not too long after the Piacenza pilgrims' visit, Jerusalem is taken over by Muslim invaders, and the Christian holy places and their treasures are mostly lost.
For hundreds of years, scholars and treasure hunters have been eagerly searching for the Holy Grail. In the Middle Ages, they're joined by one of history's most famous literary characters.
The adventures of King Arthur and his famed Knights of the Round Table are the medieval legend. Ever since these stories were written in the early 1200s, Arthur, Lancelot, Merlin, Guinevere have all become household names. And thanks to these texts and all the books and movies that they inspire, just about everybody has heard of King Arthur's quest for the Holy Grail.
The stories of Arthur and company aren't just one piece of writing. They're actually several, written by multiple unknown authors. Whoever they were, one thing that many of the writers claim is that the stories aren't actually fantasy, but real accounts, often dictated by the heroes themselves.
Like many Grail quests, King Arthur's begins with Joseph of Arimathea.
The legend tells that after Joseph draws Jesus' blood into the chalice, he's arrested and thrown in prison, but not before hiding the Grail at his home. Joseph thinks all is lost, but that night, Jesus appears to him as an apparition and gives him the cup, telling him that he will be released from prison when the time's right. Joseph spends decades locked up, but one night is miraculously set free, and he hasn't aged at all. This is our first hint of the healing and potentially immortality-granting powers of the Holy Grail.
According to the story, Joseph and a band of followers grab the cup and flee Jerusalem.
They take the Grail to Britain, supposedly to a town that today is known as Glastonbury, where they use it to found the first church in Britain. For safekeeping, Joseph stashes the Grail in an underground spring.
While King Arthur never finds the Grail, it hasn't stopped real people from looking in the area mentioned in the tale.
There's an aptly named place called the Red Spring, which is also now known as the Chalice Well because of the Grail's association with it.
Archaeologists have done some explorations and excavations, and what they found is that this place has been a holy site for thousands upon thousands of years.
Interestingly, the water is said to have healing properties. For instance, there's an account from 1750 where a local named Matthew Chancellor claims to be cured of asthma by drinking the water once a week for 7 weeks. The mayor of Glastonbury at the time, Thomas White, certifies this claim. It's published in a local magazine the next year, and on May 5th, 1751, 10,000 people from all the surrounding cities in England show up to drink the spring water for their health.
We'll never be able to prove what's down there. The well has been excavated to about 9 feet deep. The source is potentially miles down below that. If nothing else, it shows just how badly people have wanted to believe the Holy Grail is real. But it's unlikely that Joseph could have traveled to Britain. It's unlikely that King Arthur and his knights existed. But just the hint and the hope that something is hiding at the bottom of this spring has been enough to sustain it as a destination for centuries.